Hi guys, hey, it's good to see you again. Hey, this is just going to be a short, quick video on camshafts. We're going to talk about three different things. We're going to talk about camshaft lobe, we're going to talk about lift, and we're going to talk about duration. This is going to just be a super basic overview or instruction about camshafts and their basics, and then if you want to get into the minor details of camshafts and so on and so forth, there's plenty of information that you can find on that, but we're just going to cover some of the basic stuff. Okay, so again, the camshaft, we know its responsibility is to open valves, so its job is to open the valves. That's what the camshaft does. The camshaft has a component on it that is called a lobe. Okay, and this lobe is the part that rides or pushes against the lifter. Typically, in some cases, it'll push directly against the valve itself. Pushes against the lifter then in turn pushes on the push rod, and then in turn pushes on the rocker arm, and the rocker arm opens the valve. And so we'll talk a little bit about those details, but that is the lobe. So here's a picture of a lobe here. Here's a picture of the lobe that would be actually pushing on the lifter assembly here, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So this is what the lobe is. The second thing we're going to talk about when it comes to camshafts is lift. Okay? And lift is describing how far open the valve is going to be. Okay? Distance of open. Now again, this is super basic stuff. This is try to dummy it down so that it's simple to understand. Distance of open. And that lift on a camshaft is measured from the rounded area here. If it was just a circle, from this area to this area, this distance, this rise in the lobe, this is the lift. Okay, so it's how far open the valve is, or the camshaft, how far open the valve will be based on the camshaft lift of the lobe, that distance. Now that lift and that distance can vary a little bit. So if we take a look here, this lift on the lobe is transferred to the rocker arm. Now, in turn, we got to try to remember that our rocker arm pivot is typically not right in the very center of the rocker arm. It's usually closer to the push rod area. So therefore, the distance from the push rod to the center, the pivot point of the lifter, is shorter than the distance from the center of the lifter pivot to the valve. Now, why is that important? That's because the lift here, the distance that the push rod raises or pushes against the lifter, that distance is larger when it comes to the valve because of the difference in the distance, the leverage point. So you can think about it, think about a leverage of a, teeter-totter maybe. And if that teeter-totter pivot was off center of the teeter-totter, then one side would travel much farther than the other side. So you can see that the lift of a camshaft can be affected by the type of rocker arm that we have as well. Why is lift important? Lift is important because we want to be able to get the valve open a good distance so airflow is easier, air and fuel mixture is easier drawn into the cylinder. And the wider you can do that, the easier that flow is and the more air and fuel you can get in. There are some details about that can be counterproductive, and therefore you would need to do some research on cam lift and start to understand that a little bit better. But all of these things are The distance of the lift greatly affects the performance of the engine. The last thing that we're going to talk about here is duration. So duration. Duration is the amount of time valve is open. Now, there are some varying details about duration that you may want to study. It's called the 0.050 measurement, but you'll have to do some research on that. But this is just the basics, as I said before. Duration is the amount of time that the valve is open. So from the time that the valve starts to open, wherever this lobe makes contact with the lifter is the start time. Start, because the valve now is beginning to open because we've made contact. And as the camshaft rotates, it's that point at which the valve closes. Okay, and that's the duration, this amount of time that it takes for this cam or the valve to go from open to close is duration. And duration can be changed by the shape of the lobe. So if we have a lobe that is shaped like this, big and rounded, well, that's a terrible picture. Let me try again. So if we have a lobe that's, let's see, large and rounded like that, so your lobe would look more like this. That has a long duration because we have lots of contact from here to here, okay, lots of movement, as opposed to a lobe that may look more like this, okay, because the contact may not happen until a little bit later in the lobe. That's important because we want to have the valve open long enough to get fuel in. And the more fuel we can get in, the more air and fuel we can get into the chamber, the more compression that we can create, the bigger explosion and the more performance we can get. The drawback to this is that we must remember that the camshaft rotates only half as fast as the crankshaft. Why is that? Because the crankshaft has 2 revolutions to every 1 revolution of the camshaft because of the 4 strokes. So therefore, if our duration, the time that the valve is open, is too long, now what you have is, depending on if, for example, it's on the intake stroke, the piston will come down and then start to go back up if the duration of the valve being open is too long. In other words, it stays open too long, the piston may be traveling back up and therefore start to push the fuel mixture back out of the intake valve. So duration is important depending on the length of your stroke and the type of motor and what you're trying to do. And we're going to talk a little bit about bore size and strokes in the next lesson. But that's your basics of camshafts. Take a look at the picture that I have posted with this lesson to give you a better overview of the overall look of the camshaft, and you'll be able to pinpoint or isolate those lobes and so on and so forth. But try to remember those 3 things. Lobe, that's the part that pushes against the lifter that in turn opens the valve. Lift, that's how long the valve, or how far the valve is open. That's the distance from the top of the lobe down to where it would just be a circle. So this distance here of the lobe is the lift, and then the duration is the amount of time that the valve is open. So the wider the lobe, the longer the duration, or the longer the valve is open. The narrower the lobe and the shorter the lobe, certainly if it doesn't have as much lift, it will be open less time as well. And so duration is the time that the valve is open. Take care of the worksheet, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. Thanks.